Hi, I am making the binding today for my sweet pea quilt, and in my stash I had this piece of fabric, actually two of them. It's from Andover Fabrics. It is a laundry basket design. So I was really happy to have found this because it exactly matches the light pink blush colors of the sweet pea quilt, and I'm going to be using it in my binding. I need to cut 6 2.5-inch wide strips to sew together to make my nice long binding to fit all the way around my 60-inch square quilt. So I'm just going to go through and show you real quickly how to prepare that binding so that the next time you're doing some quilt binding, you can have a video to refer to. So setting this second piece aside, I'm going to make sure that I've squared up one of the sides of this fabric because it's been in my stash a while, so that I have a nice squared side to measure from. And once you square off one side, go ahead and flip it over, and then you'll have that nice straight edge to measure from. Make sure that you're measuring on the right side of your ruler, starting with the 1 inch and going across. So I need 2.5-inch wide strips. Lining up those horizontal lines on my fold, and I'm lining up the vertical lines right along that nice straight edge that I just trimmed. So again, I need to cut 6 of them. So I've got my 6 strips all cut for my quilt binding, and the next thing I need to do is to trim the ends of each of these strips at a 45-degree angle. Here's where I really like my little Easy Square Junior ruler. It's just easy to manipulate around. Any of your quilt rulers will have a 45-degree line on them, so go ahead and find that line and line it up with the bottom, I guess the top edge would work too, of your strip. And then you can easily cut each of the strips at a 45-degree angle. You want to be cutting them so that when you open up that strip, your angles are facing in opposite directions. So go ahead and cut each of the strips at a 45-degree angle, and then we will sew them together. Now that you've got all of your strips trimmed, go ahead and open them each up. You are going to be pinning them together and sewing them end to end to make one long strip. So you'll notice that you have your 45-degree edge, and the way you're going to match these up is to line them up perpendicular to each other, right sides together. There'll be about, maybe 1/4 of an inch or so of overlap right on the ends, and go ahead and line up those 45-degree sides just like that. I just like to put 2 pins in to hold them in place, and you're ready to sew them together. Okay, so now that you have your pieces, your ends pieced together, overlapping just a little bit, go ahead and use a 1/4-inch seam allowance and stitch them together and remove the pins as you're coming up to them. And it's just that easy, and we'll go ahead and get these all stitched together so we have one long strip. So I've got all 6 of my binding strips sewed together diagonally to each other on those 45-degree cut lines. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to want to press open the seams of where you stitched each of these strips together to each other. So I've got my iron set on the highest setting. I'm not using any type of spray or anything at this point. I'm just really going to just go through and press each one of those seams open first of all. And then we'll fold the binding strip in half lengthwise, and we'll press it in half to get it ready to sew onto the quilt. When I'm pressing these seams open, sometimes I like to go ahead and open them with my fingers first and just give them a little bit of a finger press. Just makes it work a little easier, and then just go ahead and lay your iron right on top. You really don't want to go back and forth. You might stretch out the fabric by doing that, by ironing back and forth, but just really press it down hard for a few seconds, and that's all it takes. So I have each of these seams pressed open, and the very last step that it's going to take to prepare your binding strip is to go ahead and press it in half lengthwise with the wrong sides facing each other this time. I do a quick press through with just the dry iron to start having the fabric lay nice and straight down together. And then what I like to do to finish that off is actually just use a little bit of finishing spray to just give you that nice crisp fold. Eventually, you're going to be sewing this strip onto the quilt top that you have finished quilting. You're going to be sewing it on with the raw edge, and then this nice crisp fold that you're making with the finishing spray is going to be nice to hand stitch to the back. So that really is it. You'll just have one nicely folded long binding strip to sew onto your quilt, depending on how big your quilt is. You can determine the length of binding strip that you need by taking the measurements of each side of the quilt and adding them up. And then what I like to do is add an extra 2 inches for each of the 4 corners. So add another 8 inches onto that total measurement. And that should give you enough binding strip for your quilt top. Take this measurement and divide it by 42 if you're using a complete width of fabric. And that will tell you how many 2.5 inch binding strips that you'll need to cut apart and sew together. So I just wanted to quickly show you yet the finished product, the nice long binding strip that turned out to get put together by sewing 6 2.5 inch strips end to end on 45-degree angles, and then pressing them in half, the wrong sides facing together. This is the binding that I'm choosing for my Sweet Pea quilt, and I'm so excited. The colors all match up just great. It's just so fun, and I think it's going to be such an adorable little binding for this quilt. So watch my channel for a video on how to sew together the binding on the quilt edge, and especially focusing on how to make those mitered corners. They are really easy to do, and if you are worried about making a mitered corner be nice and crisp, after you watch that video, you don't have to worry about that any longer. It's a simple process, I promise.